Imagine you're not a billionaire sovereign fund manager in a glass tower. Imagine you're a coffee farmer in Kenya. You own a small textile workshop in Senegal. For most of your life, the global economy has treated you like a supplier, not a partner. You grow something real. You stitch something real. You turn soil and sweat into a product that people claim they want. And then it hits the border. A wall of paperwork, a wall of standards, a wall of tariffs and quotas that don't feel like economics. They feel like a reminder of rank. The message is always the same. Your job is to produce. Our job is to decide whether you're allowed to sell. You get used to being told, not yet. Not until you reform. Not until you liberalize. Not until you sign 10 agreements written in languages you didn't choose, with rules you didn't design. Trading begins to feel less like a market and more like a permission slip. Then, one day, the phone rings. And it's Beijing. Now precision matters, because history is made of dates, and power is made of timing. The first shockwave lands at China's Big Africa Summit in early September 2024, at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. The kind of gathering staged inside buildings that don't hide what they are. Monuments to the idea that the world has a center and you are visiting it. Red carpets. Orchestrated smiles. Photographs that imply partnership, while the architecture quietly whispers hierarchy. Then China drops the line that makes traders sit up straighter, duty-free. Treatment for 100% of tariff lines for the least. Developed countries that maintain diplomatic relations with China. That sentence looks technical, almost boring. But it carries the weight of a door unlocking. Then it gets teeth. China later says the expanded 100% coverage takes effect on December 1, 2024, for those eligible countries. And then, because geopolitics is never content with one move, comes the escalation. In June 2025, China announces it will remove all tariffs on exports from 53 African countries. It recognizes diplomatically essentially every African state except Eswatini, which maintains ties with Taiwan. And suddenly, this is no longer a small discount on a few products. This is not a token gesture. This is China making an offer so wide it looks like an event. A near continent-wide opening, which triggers the real question, the only question that matters. Why would the world's factory throw open its gates to African competition? Is this benevolence? A soft power romance? A desperate bid for allies in a new Cold War? Or is it something colder? Something that sounds like generosity until you read it like an accountant reads a balance sheet. Because under the hood, China isn't just adjusting a tariff schedule. It's trying to rewire incentives, pull African exports deeper into China's consumer market, reshape supply chains, and lock in political relationships at the exact moment global trade is fracturing into rival blocs. This isn't a charity story. This is a trade gamble, one of the biggest of the 21st century. So let's set the table properly. Early September 2024. Beijing, Great Hall of the People. The kind of building designed to make you feel like you've stepped inside someone else's empire. Inside, 53 African delegations. It's not necessarily 53 presidents standing shoulder to shoulder, but enough heads of state, prime ministers, and senior officials to make foreign ministries in Washington and Brussels feel easy. The missing seat matters too. Eswatini, the only African country still recognizing Taiwan rather than Beijing. That absence is the quiet knife behind the velvet curtain. It's China reminding everyone that in the modern world, trade policy and diplomatic recognition aren't separate boxes. They're the same machine. Summits like this usually follow a predictable ritual. Handshake, announcement. Banquet, press releases. A new acronym. Everyone flies home with promises. But this time, the script changes. China puts forward a headline package, tens of billions in support over multiple years. And yes, the money matters. But money wasn't the line that made analysts flinch. The line was the trade offer. Zero tariff treatment. Most trade deals, Western trade deals, come with fine print thick enough to crush your foot. Sensitive product exclusions, quota traps, sunset clauses. Political conditions that can be pulled like a lever when you stop behaving. The U.S. has programs that can open markets, sure, but they can also expire. They can be revoked. They can be tied to political criteria that shift with elections and headlines. The EU's market access often arrives with standards, hurdles, and negotiation tunnels so long that by the time you reach daylight, your economy has moved on. China's framing is different. Unilateral, one-way opening. No public demand that Africa must lower tariffs first as an entrance fee. The message is, we drop the border tax you sell. And for many African leaders, that message is psychologically explosive because it suggests trade without humiliation, access without permission rituals. But let's not be naive. There is no free lunch in geopolitics, especially not one served under chandeliers. So what is China actually buying? Here's the first clue. This offer arrives at a moment when global trade is splitting into blocks. Rival supply chains, de-risking, friendshoring, the old idea that goods move freely, is dying. And when that world dies, every major power starts doing the same thing. They look for dependable partners. They look for control over inputs. They look for leverage that doesn't require a navy. China, more than anyone, understands that trade is not just commerce. Trade is the bloodstream of power, and it's also an early warning system. If you control who sells into your market hand, what currency they settle in, and what platform they use, then you are not just a buyer. You are an architect. Now add the second clue. For decades, the China-Africa trade pattern has been painfully familiar. Africa exports raw materials. China exports finished goods. Africa digs, China manufactures. Africa sells low margin. China sells high margin. That imbalance doesn't just shape GDP, it shapes dependence. And then, China signals a different invitation. Not only sell us your rocks, but sell us your value-added products. Don't just sell cocoa beans, sell chocolate. Don't just sell cotton, sell shirts. Don't just sell coffee chairs, sell processed coffee. On paper, it sounds like development. But, in reality, it's a bet. Because zero tariffs isn't the story. It's the opening scene. The real story is what China gets in return when the door swings open and a continent walks through it. And to understand that, we have to talk about what China is quietly running short on. Not money, not ambition, but something more dangerous for an empire. Cheap labor, cheap growth, and strategic insulation. And once a superpower starts running short on those, it doesn't shrink, it relocates. Now we're at the moment where the story stops being about tariffs and starts being about gravity. Because when a country becomes wealthy, it doesn't just get richer, it gets heavier. Wages rise, expectations rise. Young workers stop seeing factory floors as a future and start seeing them as a punishment. Parents don't want their children inhaling chemicals and glue fumes for 12 hours a day. They want them in air-conditioned. Offices arguing about spreadsheets. This is what development looks like from the inside. A nation upgrades. And when a nation upgrades, it can't stay the world's cheapest workshop forever. China is colliding with that wall right now. Picture a shoe factory in Shenzhen in 2005. You could make a low-margin product, ship it across oceans, and still profit because labor was cheap enough to forgive almost every inefficiency. The entire model ran on one magic trick: low-cost work at scale. Fast forward to the 2020s. That trick is fading. Not because China became lazy, because China did what every successful manufacturing empire does. It climbed the ladder, and the higher you climb, the more expensive every step becomes. You can feel it in the numbers. Average wages differ by region, sector, and whether you're in a private or state-linked unit, but the direction is unmistakable. Chinese labor is no longer global bargain labor, skilled, costly, and increasingly unwilling to do the dirtiest jobs. Meanwhile, in parts of Africa, you have the opposite demographic math: a younger population. Governments desperate for jobs and wages in some light manufacturing contexts that are dramatically lower than in China. And this is where the old economic pattern returns, the one that repeats across history like a migration route. Economists have a name for it: the flying geese paradigm. Industries move from the lead goose to the next goose, and then the next. Japan passed low-end manufacturing to Korea and Taiwan. Korea and Taiwan passed it to coastal China, and now parts of that low-end work are looking for a new home. If you are a Chinese factory owner staring at rising payroll, tighter environmental enforcement, and a domestic workforce that increasingly doesn't want the job, you get forced into a choice. Pay modern China wages for old China products, watch your margins bleed out quietly. Move the factory. Africa becomes the obvious direction of travel, not as a charity project, but as arbitrage. And it's already happening. Chinese firms have invested in industrial parks, special economic zones, and manufacturing ecosystems across the continent. This isn't rumor. It's been documented in multiple countries. Zones that function like plug-and-play industrial corridors, power, logistics, and policy carve-outs, built to attract production that doesn't want to stay in high-wage hubs. The famous early symbol of this shift was footwear. Chinese manufacturers investing in places like Ethiopia, ramping production with thousands of local workers, turning a low-income country into a node in a global value chain. Now connect this back to the zero-tariff story and you begin to see the mechanism. Tariffs are not just taxes. Tariffs are traffic signals. When China expands duty-free coverage, it isn't only making African exports cheaper, it's potentially making a new highway for relocated production to cash out. Here's the model in plain English. Labor-intensive manufacturing migrates out of China into African zones. Chinese capital, machinery, and managerial control often come with it. The Made in Africa output, if it satisfies rules of origin requirements, can move into China with minimal tariff friction. China gets the goods without needing to keep the low-wage factories inside China. Africa gets jobs and activity, but the question becomes, who owns the factory and who owns the margin? Because this is where things get politically delicate. When a Chinese-linked company produces goods in Africa, are those goods African or Chinese? Legally, under trade rules, it depends on rules of origin, how much value is created locally, whether substantial transformation happened, whether paperwork and thresholds are met. In practice, rules of origin are where reality and loopholes shake hands. If the rules are met cleanly or creatively, you get something powerful, a product that looks African in trade statistics, while the control structure behind it remains Chinese. And this matters even more in an era where Made in China is increasingly politicized, tariffs, de-risking rhetoric, and sanction threats. So Africa can be, simultaneously, a real opportunity for industrialization, skills transfer, and export growth. Local partners climb the chain and capture genuine capability. A routing system for Chinese capital to preserve market access while shifting the labor-intensive burden elsewhere. That dual reality is not a contradiction. It's how power works. Now we zoom out again, because this wasn't only about factories. It was also about detonation, why China suddenly needs Africa to export more. Stand in Nairobi at the terminus of Kenya's standard gauge railway. Gleaming station, clean lines. Infrastructure that looks like the future. Built with heavy Chinese financing. But for years, the export picture across many corridors had the same haunting imbalance. Imports arrive dense and heavy. Exports struggle to match them. Result, empty containers. Stacks of them. A logistics problem that's also a metaphor. That empty container problem isn't shipping trivia, it's the entire relationship, embodied in steel boxes. China has sold more to Africa than it buys from Africa. That means African countries bleed foreign currency. When they bleed foreign currency, debt repayment becomes harder. When repayment becomes harder, the lender's balance sheet gets uglier. This is the part everyone misses while chanting slogans. Oh, you creditor. Can pressure a borrower. But if the borrower collapses, the creditor doesn't win. The creditor eats the loss. So China's logic evolves from build roads to something more urgent. Fill the roads. Fill the ports. Fill the containers on the way out. Not as kindness, as balance sheet hygiene. Because if Africa can't export, Africa can't pay. And if Africa can't pay, China gets stuck holding risk it can't easily monetize. So the tariff removal starts to look less like a gift and more like a stabilizer, turning debtors into vendors, pushing trade flows in both directions to keep the entire machine liquid enough to survive. And then, beneath all of that, comes the layer that makes Washington's ears perk up like a radar dish. Currency. If China increases buying from Africa, trade volume rises. If trade volume rises, Beijing can nudge the conversation away from dollars and toward renminbi settlement, not as a decree, but as a practical convenience tied to finance, conversion deals, and debt management. No dramatic announcement, no fireworks. just plumbing. And in global power, plumbing is destiny. So now we've exposed the real engine. The zero-tariff promise is not just market access. It is a tool to absorb low-end manufacturing migration, keep Chinese supply chains dominant even when production relocates, stabilize borrowers so they can keep buying and keep paying, and quietly expand China's leverage over trade rails, standards, and settlement. Which leads to the next uncomfortable question. Even if the door is open, who actually captures the value once the goods start moving? Because in global trade, the farmer is rarely the one who gets rich. The one who gets rich is the one who controls the gate. Now we arrive at the pivot that most headlines miss. For years, the story was simple. China builds infrastructure in Africa. Roads, railways, ports, power plants. Critics called it debt trap diplomacy. Supporters called it development. Both sides missed the more uncomfortable truth. Infrastructure only matters if it produces cash flow. By the early 2020s, China learned this lesson the hard way. Across the continent, several borrowers were struggling. Debt servicing became painful. Defaults began appearing. Not because China tricked countries, but because the math stopped working when exports failed to keep pace with imports. This is the creditor's nightmare. You can threaten. You can restructure. But you cannot extract repayment from an economy that doesn't earn. That's when Beijing's thinking shifted from building roads to filling them. Because an empty railway doesn't generate sovereignty, it generates liabilities. And this is where trade policy suddenly becomes a survival tool not just for Africa, but for China itself, turning debtors into vendors. China-Africa trade hit record volumes in the early 2020s, hundreds of billions in goods moving both ways. But the balance mattered more than the volume. Africa sold commodities. China sold finished goods. That imbalance meant African foreign reserves drained faster than they refilled. And drained reserves mean missed payments, renegotiations, and political backlash. From Beijing's perspective, the solution wasn't ideological, it was mechanical. If Africa exports more especially higher-value goods, then Africa earns more foreign currency. If Africa earns more, it services debt more reliably. If debt is serviced, Chinese balance sheets stay cleaner. So zero tariffs stop looking like generosity. They start looking like risk management. China is not asking African countries to become richer out of kindness. It is asking them to become richer so they don't default. And now we layer in the next vulnerability. China is obsessed with food. Feeding the dragon. China must feed roughly 20% of the world's population with a fraction of global arable land. This is not a talking point in Beijing. It's a strategic anxiety. As incomes rise, diets shift. More meat, more dairy, more fruit, more coffee, more spice. And meat requires feed. Feed requires land. Land is something China does not have in abundance. Now imagine a future geopolitical crisis, shipping disruptions, sanctions, naval blockades. Food security stops being an economic topic and becomes a national security doctrine. So China does what it always does when it sees a bottleneck. It builds redundancy. Africa, with its vast uncultivated arable potential, becomes the obvious counterweight. This is why agricultural exports coffee, chili, sesame, avocados, beef keep showing up in China-Africa cooperation frameworks. Not as side projects, but as structural supply chain rewiring. Take Rwanda and dried chili. The precise tonnage figures floating around online are often exaggerated, but the verified core matters more. China opened protocols that allowed Rwandan chili exports into its market, forcing Rwanda's supply chain to industrialize rapidly just to meet scale. This is how China's market power works. It doesn't buy small, it forces scale. A single contract can restructure an entire agricultural sector not because China demands it, but because the volume leaves no alternative, and that's where the real gate appears. The gate behind the gate tariffs are visible barriers. But in modern trade, the real wall is non-tariff barriers, sanitary rules, phytosanitary inspections, quarantine approvals, labeling standards. This is where trade dreams quietly die. China's SPS system is strict, technical, and crucially discretionary. When relations are warm, approvals accelerate. When relations cool, inspectors suddenly find issues. No tariffs raised. No agreements violated. Just a gate slowing down. China knows this power well. It has used it before. So when Beijing talks about green lanes for African agricultural exports fast-tracked inspection, priority clearance, it's offering something far more valuable than zero tariffs. It's offering predictable passage. But predictable passage is not permanent. It is conditional, which means African exporters gain opportunity but also inherit exposure. The cash crop trap. Now comes the darker second-order effect. Export demand reshapes incentives. If an export crop earns triple what local staples earn, farmers rationally switch. Enough switching and you get reduced local food production, rising domestic prices, and food insecurity while food is being exported abroad. This isn't new. It's the cash crop curse, and it has existed for centuries. Zero tariffs don't cause it, but they accelerate it. Industrial agriculture also brings monoculture, chemical dependency, fertilizer imports, and supply chains that are efficient but fragile. So Africa faces a knife-edge outcome. Managed well, China's demand can catalyze productivity, income, and industrial logistics. Managed poorly, it can hollow out food sovereignty and deepen dependency on external buyers. And agriculture is only the appetizer, because beneath the soil lies the real prize. It's not about bananas, it's about batteries. Every modern economy now runs on one invisible system. Batteries, EVs, grid storage, phones, drones, defense systems. And batteries require a specific cocktail of minerals: lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, many of which Africa sits on in globally significant quantities. China understood this before the West fully woke up. For over a decade, Chinese firms have been locking down upstream access and midstream processing, especially the refining stages that actually create leverage. The US and EU are only now racing to respond with duressing policies and critical mineral strategies. China's zero-tariff move fits cleanly into this chessboard. If minerals are processed in Africa by Chinese-linked firms, and those refined products enter China at low or zero tariff, China has effectively built a closed-loop supply chain that is geographically dispersed but strategically unified. Africa gets factories. China gets inputs. The West gets locked out of choke points it didn't secure early enough. And once processing plants are built, once roads, power lines, ports, and contracts exist, those relationships become physical. Physical relationships don't dissolve easily. They survive elections. They survive headlines. They survive rhetoric. This is not colonialism in the old sense. It's something more subtle. A system where ownership, standards, logistics, finance, and market access quietly align toward one gravitational center. And here's the irony. African leaders can cut ribbons. They can point to factories. They can say, truthfully, we're no longer just digging holes. Everyone wins on paper. Except perhaps the countries that arrive late and realize the supply chains are already welded into place. Which is why this story doesn't end in ports or farms. It ends in platforms. Because whoever controls distribution controls destiny. And China is already building the software layer beneath the hardware. That's where we go next. You still think international trade is mostly men in suits signing documents? You're already behind the curve. Trade in the 2020s doesn't end at the port, ends on a screen. Picture a live stream in Beijing, ring lights, fast-talking hosts, countdown timers flashing red, viewers tapping by at reflex speed, Ken standing next to the influencer smiling, nodding, fully committed to the performances, not a celebrity. It's a diplomat. This isn't a metaphor. It's happened. African ambassadors have appeared on Chinese e-commerce live streams selling coffee, chili, and agricultural products directly to Chinese consumers. In some cases, thousands of units sold in seconds. Not because the product was miraculous, but because the platform turned attention into demand at scale. This is what the digital Silk Road actually looks like. Not speeches, not treaties. Platforms. From tariffs to traffic, the zero-tariff policy is the headline. It lowers the cost of entry. But the digital layer is what makes that entry usable. Because the hardest part of exporting is not production. It's discovery, trust, payment, logistics, and compliance. Most small producers fail not because they can't grow or make things, but because they can't reach buyers at scale without being eaten by middlemen. China's platform ecosystem solves that in China's terms. Alibaba's e-commerce infrastructure, payment rails, logistics networks, and data systems don't just facilitate trade. They shape behavior. They determine which products surface, how they're marketed, how quickly they ship, and how disputes are resolved. When African exporters plug into these systems, they don't just gain customers, they inherit an operating system. And operating systems create lock-in. Switching later becomes expensive, not legally impossible, but structurally painful. Because once your packaging, compliance, payments, marketing cadence, and customer data are built around one ecosystem, diversification becomes a strategic project, not a casual choice. This is how power shifts quietly. Data is the invisible export. Every transaction generates intelligence. What sells? At what price? In which cities? During which seasons? With which promotions? Through which logistics routes? This data doesn't just inform future purchases. It informs supply chain design. Over time, the buyer stops guessing. The buyer knows. And the one who knows the market best eventually shapes it. So while zero tariffs look like market access, the platform layer turns access into dependence, not by force, but by convenience. And convenience is more persuasive than coercion. Currency, the plumbing that decides power. Now we descend into the part of the system most people never see it, which determines everything. Settlement currency. When African exporters sell into China and buy inputs from China machinery, fertilizer, packaging, running the transaction through US dollars becomes inefficient. FX fees, correspondent banks, time delays, sanctions, exposure. The rational choice becomes local settlement. Not because Beijing orders it, but because incentives point there. So renminbi usage begins to rise not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, quietly, structurally. This is not the end of the dollar moment you see in headlines. This is erosion through plumbing. And plumbing defines empires. Washington notices timing matters. China's zero-tariff announcement lands as the United States' flagship. Africa Trade Program AGOA drifts toward uncertainty. Renewal debates, political conditions, eligibility threats. From an African leader's perspective, the contrast is stark. One system offers access that can expire with elections. The other embeds access into infrastructure, platforms, and long-term trade architecture. Privileges can be revoked. Infrastructure stays. This is why the move hits Washington harder than it looks. It's not just about trade. It's about who gets to write the rules of integration. And now comes the fine print, because zero doesn't always mean free. The non-tariff wall China's market is open. But it is not forgiving. Sanitary and phytosanitary rules, labeling requirements, inspection protocols, traceability standards, these are real barriers, and they are enforced unevenly. When relations are good, approvals accelerate. When relations sour, shipments stall. No tariffs raised, no agreements violated. Just a gate slowing down. This gives China leverage that doesn't look like leverage and, therefore, attracts less resistance. Who actually wins? Here's the uncomfortable truth. The biggest winners of zero-tariff access are often not small farmers or workshops. They are aggregators, the entities that bundle supply, manage compliance, control shipping, and absorb risk. And very often, those entities are Chinese trading firms or joint ventures where Chinese partners control distribution. African producers get access. Middlemen get margins. The structure matters. Because without strong domestic industrial policy, financing, and bargaining coordination, value capture drifts upward to whoever controls the choke points. And now we zoom out to the final question. This system can work. It can accelerate industrialization. It can create jobs. It can shift Africa's role in the global economy faster than decades of aid programs. Or it can harden into a new dependency, one enforced not by gunboats, but by platforms, contracts, and logistics. Which future emerges depends less on China, and more on what African states do with the opening they've been given. Because the door is open, but the room beyond it was designed by someone else. And once you're inside, the rules change. Which brings us to the last chapter. the one history always writes after the experiment is complete. So let's strip away the press releases, the banquet photos, the diplomatic smiles, and the moral theater. Why did China really do this? China did not scrap tariffs for Africa out of generosity. It did not wake up one morning seized by altruism. And it certainly did not misunderstand the consequences. China placed a wager, cold actuarial wager, about the future of its own economy and the future of global power. Beijing looked at the math and saw a convergence of pressures closing in at the same time. An aging population, rising wages, slowing domestic demand, growing vulnerability in food supply, increasing hostility from Western trade blocs. A world fragmenting into rival systems faster than treaties could keep up. And in that world, Africa stopped looking like a charity case. It started looking like infrastructure. Africa becomes the farm that feeds a food insecure superpower. The mine that supplies the minerals of electrification. The factory floor for labor-intensive production China no longer wants at home. The growth engine that offsets stagnation elsewhere. This was not emotional. It was strategic triage. While the West debated values, conditions, and renewals, China rearranged the board. The illusion of choice and the reality of leverage, here's the hard truth that makes people uncomfortable. Africa did not choose between China and the West. Africa chose momentum. Zero tariffs are not the reward. They are the hook. The real exchange is not coffee for cars or lithium for batteries. It is integration for optionality. Africa gains access, but at the price of entanglement. Supply chains get built, standards get aligned, platforms get adopted, currencies start flowing differently. And once those systems are in place, walking away becomes expensive, not politically, but economically. This is how modern dependence forms, not with flags, not with troops, with logistics. The two futures there are two versions of this story, and both are plausible. In the first, African governments use this opening with discipline. They enforce local ownership. They demand skills transfer. They build domestic financing capacity. They diversify export destinations. They treat China as a partner, not a lifeline. In that version, the zero-tariff gamble accelerates something real. Manufacturing grows. Agricultural productivity rises. Wage labor expands. Africa moves up the value chain faster than at any point since independence. That would be historic. In the second version, the opening is consumed instead of invested. Exports grow, but margins stay thin. Factories arrive, but ownership stays foreign. Platforms dominate, but local alternatives never emerge. Governments chase short-term revenue and ignore structural power. In that world, Africa does not become poor. It becomes dependent, not colonized by maps and borders, but by spreadsheets, contracts, and supply chains too integrated to exit cleanly. The chains are no longer iron. They are logistical. China's real confidence, what makes this move dangerous and impressive, is that China believes it can manage either outcome. If Africa thrives, China benefits from a larger, richer partner base integrated into its economic system. If Africa stagnates, China still controls the pipes. Either way, the center of gravity shifts. That is why this matters more than another trade agreement. This is systems competition, and systems don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves later, when reversal becomes costly. The final question history will not ask whether China was kind or cruel. It will ask something colder. Who captured the surplus? Who wrote the standards? Who owned the infrastructure when the cycle turned? Because cycles always turn. Pearls collapsed. Oil peaked. Gas will eventually fade. Every empire believes its advantage is permanent right, up until the moment it isn't. China understands this better than most. That's why it's already thinking past tariffs, past minerals, past even manufacturing, toward control of the systems that decide who trades, how they trade, and in what currency they settle. Africa has been offered a seat at that table. Not as a guest, as a component. Whether that becomes liberation or lock-in depends on choices being made right now, quietly, technocratically, far from headlines. This was not charity. It was a hire. And history will decide whether Africa negotiated the terms or merely signed the contract.